For those with a serious or terminal illness or disability, Canadian courts, lawmakers, and culture say there are only two options: a slow, painful death or a quick, easy, assisted suicide. But there is a third option. Join us as we investigate the palliative care alternative and why Canadians should be choosing it. Our exploration on palliative care is nearly done. To close out our conversations on this important subject, we sat down in the nation's capital with a man who has extensive and broad social policy expertise. Mr. Ray Pennings is the Executive Vice President and co-founder of Cardis, a Christian think tank that focuses on the renewal of social architecture. We asked Ray how all the various spheres of society can respond to the need for better end-of-life care.
In the spring of 2015, Cardis published a report with our team that I ended up being the lead author on. We published it under the title "Death is Natural," and it was released here in Ottawa with the support of all three major political parties. So really there are three themes in the report. The first talks about death is natural. We did a public opinion poll in which we asked Canadians, how would you like to die? Most Canadians, if you ask them, would say, I would like to die at home, surrounded by my loved ones, pain-free. Yet, 70% die in acute care hospital bed. There are lots of reasons for that, some of them policy, some of them structural. But our focus was, first of all, to create an environment in which Canadians' aspiration for a natural death, which we defined as death of natural causes, in an intimate environment, surrounded by your natural caregivers. If that's the objective, then there are a host of policy questions that come. Who are our natural caregivers? Well, family is the first thing that comes to mind, but there are many people in our society who don't have families to care for them. The second point that we highlighted in this report is that there is a continuum of care that is required. When we think of palliative care, we usually think of that period immediately prior to death, when a terminal diagnosis is there. We suggest that we ought to think about death in the same way as we think about birth. It's a major process in the cycle of life. When someone is born, society invests all sorts of mechanisms. We have prenatal classes. We spend a lot of time in terms of making sure that care is provided in all of its dimensions for newborns. We need to provide a similar investment in thinking about death. Up until the last century, that was a fairly common thing. Death was expected, but we've turned death into this medical thing where it happens with tubes and in sort of as part of the medical system. Our argument is that if the objective of medicine is the prolonging of life, the medical system is a 100% failure rate. Really, when we come to a terminal diagnosis, it's no longer about medicine and curative care. It is about palliative care, the alleviation of pain, but there's much more that's going on. There are spiritual questions, there are emotional questions, there are relationship questions. They all need to be invested in appropriately. And as a society, by giving this piece to the medical system, we have major consequences. So that's the second piece. The third flows out of it in many ways, and that's at the heart of who we are as Cardis, talking about a social architecture approach. And there is no one sphere. This is an opportunity and a challenge for the church. This is an opportunity and challenge for employers. This is an opportunity and challenge for neighbors. In the same way as we have a neighborhood watch program for kids, ought we not to perhaps have neighborhood care programs for those who are dying in which we provide support and help? So really the report looks at reframing end-of-life issues in a much more holistic way. I mentioned earlier 70% of people die in an acute care hospital bed. The net cost to the taxpayer of that is approximately $1,100 a day. We can provide the best of home care for $300 to $400. Take a look at the baby boomers coming in, and one can make policy arguments, fiscal arguments as to why this makes sense. Of course, of doing the report, I interviewed 30 leading Canadians, including hospital CEOs, board members, policy experts, in terms of what the challenges are. And there are a host of embedded self-interests that really don't want this. It's interesting even how we pay doctors, the fee for service. It's a fascinating little anecdote. In the smoking cessation campaign of the 70s and the 80s, We had the Cancer Society out there in the malls with their educational displays. We had the advertisements on cigarette boxes. The single factor that was the most determinative of the change in policy was a change to the OHIP fee schedule in Ontario, which doctors were provided $10 additional on a physical with someone who was a smoker in order to discuss the health consequences of smoking. That, more than any one factor, is identified in the research, in the academic research, as the cause. Well, what would happen if we said to doctors, as part of physicals for anyone over the age of 50, we're going to discuss advanced care planning. We're going to discuss, have you prepared for death, not just in terms of the medical sort of do not resuscitate and those sorts of questions, which most people haven't dealt with either and need to be dealt with, but also in terms of what's the care plan. Begin people thinking about the fact of who is going to take care of me. Have those conversations been had? So thinking of this in a much more proactive sort of way. When it comes to dying, we don't die alone. We die as a father. We die as a husband. We die as a neighbor. We die as a fellow church member. And what makes for a good death? That's something we've lost the ability. I think even many Christians have lost the ability to talk about what makes a good death. Death is not something to be avoided at all costs. We know the fact that we are all going to die, and we need to prepare and live our life in preparation for that death. And there are such a thing as good deaths, and there are many testimonies. Many people know what a good death looks like, as opposed, and it involves relationships. It's not about one person. It's about the patient and the caregiver together being at the center and create an ecosystem of support around that. And government is probably the least equipped institution to really provide care. I actually think this is a tremendous opportunity for the church as a social institution. The church as a witness is not just there vis-a-vis her own members. The church exists with a prophetic calling in the midst of society as a whole. And what is striking to me, that in a society that is illiterate about death and doesn't even have the vocabulary and doesn't even want to deal with this, we are emerging with a huge opportunity in which many of our neighbors who have no knowledge of the gospel whatsoever are going to have very real care needs. They're going to be alone. Imagine if a church would view its entire neighborhood. Let's be modest, and let's say a 20-block radius around the church. And we're going to say, we're going to make the effort to get to know every house in that 20-block neighborhood, the names and address, the names of everyone, and find out who it is that, there's a lot of people that are dying within 20 blocks of your church. Let's find out who they are. Let's knock on their door, and let's offer the Meals on Wheels that we provide to our own church members at a time of sickness. Let's offer them to the people in the 20-block neighborhood. Let's, even if they're not in a situation in terms of to invite them to church, we don't even need to start with that. Let's just knock on their door, find out about their needs, make that daily phone call to that senior who has no one calling for them. There's a lot of social isolation out there. Let's just love them. My guess is we're going to have lots of opportunity to share the gospel.